in the darkness that covers Bangkok's nights, in the middle of the crowded markets and cheap hotels, a mysterious shadow was hunting. Young tourists with backpacks full of dreams would enter this city, but some never returned home until the moment he struck. Charles Sobhraj, the serial killer who committed crimes all across Asia, the one who stole his victims' identities and lived on with their passports. This story, it's the story of a man who saw the devil in the mirror and smiled. The story of someone who saw death like a game, and every victim was a point. In this video, we're taking you in. You're gonna witness his most shocking crimes, moment by moment, word for word. His arrest, his interrogations, his punishment, and his sinister effects on society. Get ready, 'cause this journey, it's a trip into the heart of darkness. Charles Sobhraj was born on April 6, 1944, in Saigon, Vietnam. His father, Ho Chan Sobhraj, was an Indian businessman working in Vietnam, and his mother, Tran Lan Phong, was a Vietnamese woman who, during a time of war and chaos, had tied her hopes to this man for a better life. But this marriage was doomed from the start. Ho Chan, a cold and indifferent man, never accepted Charles as his own son. Charles's childhood passed in the shadow of rejection and feelings of worthlessness. He was the unwanted child, someone who was neither fully Indian nor fully Vietnamese. This feeling of not belonging was the first deep wound in his soul. When Charles was 3 years old, his father left the family and returned to India. His mother, a young and lonely woman, in the heart of a bloody war, struggled to survive and raise her son. Years later, in 1950, Charles's mother married a French soldier named Alphonse Darigaud. This French man accepted Charles as his adopted son, and the family moved to France. For Charles, this move was both hope and failure. In Paris, he felt like a stranger again. In school, the kids made fun of him, called him the Asian boy, someone who belonged nowhere. His stepfather tried to show him affection, but Charles had already learned to trust no one. In his teens, Charles started stealing. His first thefts were simple: pickpocketing in the metro, stealing from shops. But for him, these acts weren't just for the money. He got off by being able to deceive people. He realized his face, his smile, his words, they could all be weapons. At 16, Charles was arrested for the first time. His crime was stealing from a car. They sent him to a juvenile correctional facility, a place where he was supposed to learn to get back on the straight path. But Charles learned a different lesson. He learned how to lie better, how to fool the system, how to play the game. After his release, he moved on to bigger crimes: fraud, forgery, robbery. He fell in love with playing with identities. He could introduce himself as anyone. He could take on any name. For him, life was a theater. At 20, he met a French girl named Chantal Companion. Chantal was a young, naive girl who fell in love with Charles. She was willing to do anything for Charles. Charles used this blind love. He made Chantal his partner in his crimes. They traveled together, stole together, deceived together. But in 1963, they were arrested in Greece. Charles went to prison, but only for a short time. In prison, Charles realized one truth: he could escape any situation. He started studying psychology, studying laws, learning different languages. He wanted to always be one step ahead of the law. After his release, he and Chantal traveled to India. India, the land of Charles's father, a place he had never felt he belonged, now became his refuge. He realized that in India, he could work in the shadows. He could disappear and reappear with a new identity. In Bombay, Charles started scamming tourists. He would approach them, become friends, gain their trust, and then rob them blind. But soon, fraud wasn't enough for him. He wanted more. He wanted total power. In 1970, he met a Canadian woman named Marie-Andrée Leclerc. Marie-Andrée was a beautiful and intelligent girl who loved adventure. Charles fascinated her. He told Marie-Andrée he was a gem dealer, said he was rich, said he could show her a world of pleasure and excitement. Marie-Andrée believed him. They traveled together to Thailand, Nepal, Afghanistan. Charles got into smuggling jewels and drugs on these trips. He gathered a network of criminals around him. But in 1973, he was arrested in Afghanistan. They sent him to Kabul prison. But Charles, he was Charles. He escaped prison by bribing and deceiving the authorities. He and Marie-Andrée returned to Paris, but Charles couldn't stay still. He returned to the east. In Thailand, Charles met Marie-Andrée's brother, André Leclerc, who had come to visit. André was asking questions about Charles's and his sister's lives. Charles felt that André was suspicious of him. One night, André suddenly got sick. Vomiting, diarrhea, fever. They took him to the hospital, but he died. The doctors said it was dysentery, a common disease in those parts. But Marie-Andrée had her doubts. She knew her brother had drunk something from Charles before he died, but she never dared to ask directly. The fear of knowing the truth kept her silent. This was Charles Sobhraj's first murder, although it was never proven. He killed André by giving him food poisoning, and this method became one he used again and again. Charles had figured out that poisoning was a clean murder, a murder that could easily be passed off as illness. He started studying drugs and poisons. He knew what to give to whom to make them sick, or kill them, or just knock them out. In the mid-70s, Charles and Marie-Andrée settled in Bangkok. Charles operated as a gem dealer, but his main gig was something else. He hunted tourists, young tourists, the ones who were alone, the ones looking for adventure, the ones nobody would come looking for. Charles found them on the streets, in hotels, in cafes. He would befriend them, help them, invite them to his place, and then he would poison them, rob them, and if necessary, kill them. Where did these behaviors come from? Psychologists later said Charles suffered from antisocial personality disorder. He lacked a conscience. He lacked empathy. He couldn't see others as human. For him, they were just tools. A childhood full of rejection, a feeling of no identity, and a constant need to prove himself had turned him into a monster. He wanted to have power. He wanted control. He wanted others to need him, and there was no better way than killing to experience that feeling of absolute power. Every victim was a victory for him, a proof of his superiority. His first known victim was Teresa Knowlton, a 21-year-old American girl. Teresa had left the USA in October 1975 to travel to Asia. She was a happy, energetic girl who loved to travel. In Nepal, she met another girl named Jennifer Boulay. The two decided to go to Thailand together. In Bangkok, they stayed in a cheap hotel in the Charles said with a warm smile, "Hey, you look like tourists. Is this your first time here?" Teresa happily replied, "Yeah, we just thought in. This city is amazing." Charles laughed and said, "Yeah, Bangkok is a special place, but you gotta be careful. There are a lot of scammers here. If you need any help, I can help you out. I live here." Teresa and Jennifer trusted him. Charles showed them where to go, what to see, what to eat. He invited them to his place, a fancy house in a nice part of Bangkok. Marie-Andre was there too, with a kind smile. They had dinner, laughed, talked, and then Charles offered them drinks. Tasty drinks with tropical fruit flavors. Teresa and Jennifer drank. Within minutes, they got dizzy. The world was spinning around them. Charles said with a cold smile, "Not feeling too good? Maybe you should sleep it off." He took them to a room and put them on a bed. Teresa tried to speak, but her tongue was tied. She could only see Charles going through their backpacks, taking their money, taking their passports. When Teresa and Jennifer woke up, they found themselves in a dark room. They had a terrible headache. Their stomachs were churning. The door opened, and Charles walked in. He wasn't that kind man anymore. His eyes were cold and empty. He said, "You belong to me now. If you want to live, you do exactly what I say." Teresa asked, terrified, "Why are you doing this? We trusted you." Charles laughed, a soulless laugh. He said, "Trust? Trust is for suckers." In the days that followed, Charles forced them to work for him. They had to scam other tourists, bring them to Charles's house. But Teresa and Jennifer had a plan to escape. One night, when Charles was out, they escaped through a window and went to the American embassy. They told them everything, but when the police went to Charles's house, he had vanished. He had fled to India with Marie-Andre. This escape was the first, but not the last. Charles was a master at escaping. He was always one step ahead of the law. But he couldn't stop hunting. He was addicted to it. In late 1975, Charles Sobhraj and Marie-Andre came back to Thailand. This time, they changed their spot, got an apartment in a different part of Bangkok. Charles knew the cops knew him, but he had changed his look, grown a beard, wore glasses, had a fake name. He was now Alain Dupont, a French businessman. And the hunt started up again. In November 1975, two young tourists, a Turk named Vitaly Hakim and a Dutch guy named Kuki Hemaker, came to Bangkok. They were friends, planning to travel around Asia. They stayed in the same hotel where Teresa and Jennifer had been before. Charles saw them and approached them. He introduced himself as a local guide. Vitaly and Kuki were happy to find a local to help them out. Charles took them to restaurants, to temples, to markets. He told them stories, laughed, seemed like a real good friend. A few days later, Charles invited them to his place. He said he wanted to cook them a special dinner, some authentic Thai food. Vitaly and Kuki happily agreed. That night, they ate dinner, laughed, and then Charles gave them tea, hot tea, with an aromatic herb flavor. Vitaly said, "This tea is delicious." Charles smiled and said, "It's a traditional tea, good for your health." But within half an hour, Vitaly and Kuki started feeling bad. Dizziness, nausea, weakness. Kuki said, "I think I'm sick." Charles said with fake concern, "Maybe the food was bad. Let's get you to a room to rest." He took them to a room, and they lay down on the bed. Charles waited for them to fall into a deep sleep, then went through their backpacks. Money, passports. He took everything, but this time, Charles decided to go a step further. He wanted their complete identities. He poisoned them with another drug that completely knocked them out. Then, he and Marie-André put them in the car. They took them outside the city to a remote jungle. And there, Charles, with all his strength, killed Vitaly and Kuki. He beat them with a rock until they weren't breathing anymore. Then they buried the bodies. A shallow, hasty burial. A few days later, the bodies were found by local farmers. The Thai police started an investigation, but the first thing they found was the fake identity. Vitaly and Kuki's passports were with Charles. The police didn't know who had killed these two young men, but at the hotel, the staff remembered Charles. They said a man was with Vitaly and Kuki, a man who called himself Alain Dupont. But when the police went to the address Charles had given, he had vanished again. Charles was now sure he could kill anyone and get away. He felt absolute power. He wasn't just killing for money anymore. He was killing for pleasure. He loved that moment when he saw the look in his victims' eyes, the moment they realized they were gonna die. He loved the fear in their eyes. Christmas 1975 was when Charles committed most of his crimes. That week, 3 more young people disappeared. The first was Lydia Schoner, a 26-year-old girl from America. She was traveling with her French boyfriend, Jean-Luc Solomon. They were in Bangkok and planned to go to India. Charles saw them in a market. He approached and said, "You want to go to India? I can help you. I know how to find cheap tickets." Lydia and Jean-Luc listened to him. Charles took them to a fake travel agency, one he had set up himself. He sold them tickets that were fake. But before they could figure it out, Charles invited them to his place for a Christmas party. Then, he said Christmas should be celebrated with friends. Lydia and Jean-Luc happily agreed. That night, Charles cooked them dinner, a lavish dinner with wine and tropical fruits. But in the wine and food, Charles had put his drugs. Lydia and Jean-Luc ate and drank, and slowly started feeling heavy. Jean-Luc said, "I think the wine was too strong." Charles laughed and said, "Thai wine is always strong. Rest up, I'll take care of you." They slept on the couch. Charles waited for them to lose consciousness completely. Then he got to work. First, he took the passports and money. Then, he decided to try a different method this time. He strangled Lydia with a rope. He wanted to see how long it would take for her to stop breathing. Lydia tried to resist, but her body was numb. She could only open her eyes and look at Charles. Charles whispered, "Don't be afraid, it'll be over soon." And then Jean-Luc. Charles killed with a heavy blow to the head. He wanted to be quick, didn't want the man to resist. He put the bodies in the car trunk and took them to the same jungle where he had buried Vitaly and Kuki. This time, he burned them. He wanted no trace left. The smell of smoke and burnt flesh filled the jungle air. Charles stood and watched, without any emotion. For him, this was just a job that had to be done. 2 days later, a farmer found the half-burnt bodies of Lydia and Jean-Luc. The Thai police were horrified. They now knew there was a serial killer in their city, but they still didn't know who it was. Newspapers started writing about the ruthless killer murdering tourists. People were scared. Tourists started leaving Bangkok. But Charles wasn't worried. He thought he was untouchable. That same week, another young person disappeared. It was Annick Grisoni, a young French girl, 21 years old. She was alone, without friends or companions. She was traveling in Asia to find herself, to think about her life. She was staying in a cheap hostel. Charles saw her in a cafe. He approached and said, "You look lonely. Wanna talk?" Annick smiled. She felt lonely and was happy someone was talking to her. Charles told her fascinating stories about his travels, his experiences. Annick was captivated. Charles said, "I have a house. If you want, you can stay there. It's safer than the hostel." Annick was a little doubtful, but Charles seemed so kind. She agreed. That night, Charles took Annick to his house. Marie-Andre wasn't there. She had gone shopping. Charles and Annick were alone. Charles cooked her food and gave her wine. Annick drank and slowly started feeling confused. But when Annick lay on the bed, Charles came near her. He had a rope in his hand. He started strangling Annick. Annick tried to resist with all her might. She scratched, kicked, but her body was weak. Charles whispered, "Why are you resisting? Everyone dies in the end." Annick looked at him with tear-filled eyes. She couldn't believe this kind man was now killing her. And then everything went dark. Charles put Anik's body in a suitcase and took it to the jungle. This time he threw the body in a river. He thought the water would take everything away. But a few days later, Anik's body was found on the riverbank. The Thai police were now sure a dangerous killer was operating in the city. They started checking all the hotels and hostels, looking for clues. But Charles escaped again. This time he went to Nepal. He thought in Nepal, the police couldn't find him. In Kathmandu, Charles started the same routine. He approached tourists. But this time, he made a mistake. He approached a large group of French tourists. They were students on a group trip. Charles invited them to a party at his hotel. At the party, Charles gave them drinks. But this time, his drugs didn't work properly. Some of the students started feeling bad, but others didn't. One of the students, a guy named Jacques, got suspicious of Charles. He saw Charles putting something in the drinks. Jacques immediately told his friends. They realized something was wrong. The students started shouting. They called the Nepali police. Charles tried to escape, but this time it was too late. The Nepali police arrested him. When they went to his hotel room, they found horrible things. Passports belonging to various tourists, a lot of money, various drugs, and fake documents. Charles Sobhraj was finally arrested. But the story didn't end here. Charles, in a Nepali prison, started his tricks again. He bribed officials, lied to judges, tried to play innocent. He said he was just a businessman, said he was holding the passports for his friends. But the Thai police found out. They wanted Charles extradited to Thailand to stand trial. Charles knew if he went back to Thailand, he'd be executed. He had to escape. Charles in the Nepali prison started planning an escape, promised them money and freedom. One night, the guards opened his cell door. Charles escaped from prison with Marie-Andre, who had come for a visit. They fled to India and then to Europe. Charles thought he was free again, thought he could return to a normal life. But he was wrong. In 1976, Charles Sobhraj was in India trying to lay low. He knew Interpol was on his tail. He and Marie-Andre kept moving between different cities in India, from Bombay to Delhi, from Delhi to Goa. But Charles couldn't quit the hunt. He still needed money. He still craved the thrill. He started scamming tourists again, but this time he was more careful. He wasn't killing anymore, just stealing. In Bombay, Charles met a young French woman named Dominique Renelier. Dominique was a smart woman who was traveling. Charles fascinated her. He told her he was a gem dealer, said he could help her buy cheap jewelry. Dominique trusted him. They started working together, but Dominique quickly realized Charles wasn't who he claimed to be. She saw he was scamming people, saw he was using fake identities. ... Dominique told Charles, "You're a liar. I don't want to work with you." Charles laughed and said, "If you leave, you'll lose everything you have." Dominique was scared, but she was a brave woman. She decided to escape from Charles. One night, while Charles was asleep, Dominique took all the documents and money and ran. She went to the French embassy and told them everything, but he had vanished again. This time he went to Delhi and formed a new crew there. He brought in a Frenchman named Ajay Leclerc, Marie-André's brother. Ajay was a simple-minded guy who thought Charles was a good friend. Charles told Ajay they could make a lot of money together. He just needed to help. In Delhi, Charles went back to hunting tourists, but this time he had a different method. He wouldn't poison them to kill, just make them sick so he could rob them and then help them get better. He presented himself as their savior. This method was more effective for him because the victims would trust him afterwards and even give him money. One of his victims was a German man named Hermann Knippenberg. But Hermann was a different kind of man. He was a diplomat, someone not easily fooled. When Charles tried to poison him, Hermann immediately knew something was wrong. He went to the hospital and told the doctors he thought he'd been poisoned. The doctors ran tests and confirmed he had been poisoned. Hermann reported it to the Indian police. He said a man named Charles Sobhraj had poisoned him. The Indian police started an investigation. They checked the old files and realized Charles Sobhraj was the same man wanted for several murders in Thailand. They issued a warrant for his arrest. On these journeys, Charles kept up his scams. He used the identities of his previous victims, traveling with fake passports. In Istanbul, Charles planned a big job. He wanted to steal a large shipment of diamonds. He set up a meeting with a local merchant. The merchant screamed, but Charles hit him and ran. The Turkish police were on him immediately. Charles, Marie-André, and Ajay escaped in a car. They drove at high speed through the streets of Istanbul. The police were in pursuit. Charles yelled, "We have to escape. We have to get out of this city." Marie-André said fearfully, "Charles, this is madness. You're going to get us killed." They reached the Greek border, but the border police stopped them. Charles tried to get away with his fake passport, but it didn't work this time. The police arrested him. Marie-André and Ajay were also arrested. They were taken to an Istanbul prison. In prison, Charles started planning his escape. He bribed the guards, lied to the judges. He said he was just a merchant, said it was all a misunderstanding. But the Turkish police didn't trust him. They wanted to extradite him to India or Thailand. Charles knew if that happened, he would be executed. One night, Charles escaped from prison. He had tricked a guard with a bribe. He climbed down from a window and went out into the street. but he left Marie, Andre, and Ajay behind. He was only thinking of himself. He fled to Greece and then to France. In France, he hid out for a while. He lived in a small apartment in Paris, trying to be forgotten. But Interpol never forgot him. They put him on their most wanted list. In 1977, Charles decided to return to India. He thought the Indian police had forgotten him by now. He entered India with a fake identity. He went to Goa, a place with lots of tourists. In Goa, Charles started his old tricks again. He would approach tourists, deceive them. But this time, one of the tourists, an English woman named Barbara Smith, got suspicious of him. Barbara was a smart woman with a lot of travel experience. She felt something was off when Charles tried to approach her. She told Charles. Charles laughed and said, "Why? I just want to help." Barbara said, "Because I can see it in your eyes. You're lying." Charles suddenly got serious. He told Barbara, "If you're smart, you'll forget you ever saw me." Barbara got scared and ran away. She reported it to the Indian police. The police started searching for Charles. They found him in a hotel. This time, Charles couldn't escape. He was surrounded. The Indian police arrested him. When they went to his hotel room, they found a lot of stuff. Fake passports, fake documents, various drugs, a lot of money. Charles Sobhraj was finally arrested, and this time, there was no escape. Charles Sobhraj was transferred to Tihar prison in Delhi, one of the toughest and most notorious prisons in India. This prison was a place even the hardest criminals feared. Tall gray walls, armed guards, and a dark, suffocating atmosphere were everywhere. When Charles entered his cell, he felt defeated for the first time in his life. But that feeling disappeared quickly. He still believed he could escape. His first days in prison, Charles was quiet. He observed the other inmates, got to know the guards, learned the rules. He wanted to understand how the system worked. He talked to the prisoners, told them fake stories, told them he was an innocent merchant wrongly imprisoned. Some prisoners believed him. Others didn't. One day, a guard named Rajiv came to Charles's cell. Rajiv was a young man who had recently started working at the prison. Charles immediately knew Rajiv was weak, someone who could be fooled. Charles said to him with a smile, "Hello, my friend. Life is hard here, isn't it?" Rajiv nodded and said, "Yes, very hard." Charles said, "If you want, I can help you. I have money. I can give you money." Rajiv hesitated at first, but Charles persisted. He told Rajiv he just wanted some comfort in prison, wanted better food, more books, better facilities. Rajiv thought this request was reasonable. He agreed. Charles gave him money he had received from his family. Rajiv started helping Charles. He brought him better food, brought him books, even let Charles walk outside his cell more often. But Charles had a bigger plan. He wanted to escape from prison. He started gathering information. He asked Rajiv how the prison security system worked, when the guards changed shifts, where the cameras were installed. Without realizing it, Rajiv gave Charles all the information. One night, Charles said to Rajiv, "I want to meet with my lawyer. Can you arrange it?" Rajiv said, "Of course, I'll arrange it for tomorrow." But Charles didn't want to wait. He wanted to escape tomorrow night. He told Rajiv, "If you help me escape, I'll give you a lot of money. Enough, so you never have to work again in your life." Rajiv was scared. He said, "No, I can't. If they find out, they'll kill me." Charles said in a cold tone, "If you don't help, I'll tell the authorities you took a bribe from me. You'll lose your job, maybe even end up in prison yourself." Rajiv felt trapped. He didn't know what to do. Finally, the fear of losing his job and his life overwhelmed him. He said, "Okay, but you have to keep your promise." Charles smiled. He knew he had won. That night, Rajiv came to Charles' cell at midnight. He opened the door and said, "Hurry, we only have 10 minutes before the next guard comes." Charles came out of the cell. They moved through dark corridors, went downstairs. Rajiv's heart was pounding, but Charles was calm and collected. They reached the prison's back door. Rajiv opened the door and said, "Now go, quickly." Charles stepped out and looked into the night's darkness. He turned back and said to Rajiv, "Thank you, my friend, but I don't think I'll be giving you any money." Rajiv said, surprised, "What? You promised." Charles laughed and said, "I always lie." And then he disappeared into the darkness. Rajiv stood there, not knowing what to do. He knew if Charles' escape was discovered, he would be ruined. He closed the door and went back to his own quarters, praying no one would notice. But the next morning, when the guards went to Charles's cell and didn't find him, the alarm sounded. The entire prison descended into chaos. The prison warden yelled, "How did this happen? Who was responsible for this section?" They arrested Rajiv. He confessed that he had helped Charles. They fired him and sent him to prison. But Charles was now free. He hid in the streets of Delhi, in safe houses, in cheap hotels. He started planning again. He wanted to leave India. He wanted to go somewhere the police couldn't find him. But this time, the Indian police were determined. They knew Charles was still in Delhi. They put all hotels, all safe houses, under surveillance. A week later, they found Charles in a small hotel. This time, they arrested him with full force. Charles tried to resist, but it was useless. They took him back to Tihar prison, but this time they put him in the high-security wing, where escape was impossible. In prison, Charles started thinking about his future. He knew the police from Thailand, France, Nepal. They all wanted to try him. He knew if he was extradited to Thailand, he would be executed. He had to find a way to survive. He decided to make a deal with the Indian authorities. He told them he was willing to confess, willing to say where he had buried his victims' bodies, but only if they promised not to extradite him to Thailand. The Indian authorities thought about this offer. They wanted to solve many cases. They wanted the victims' families to find peace. They agreed with Charles. Charles began to confess. He said he had killed 7 people in Thailand. He said he had killed 3 people in Nepal. He said he had killed 2 people in India. But even with these confessions, Charles still tried to make himself seem less guilty. He said he only killed for money. Said he never killed for pleasure. He said he didn't choose his victims. They came to him. He tried to justify everything, tried to portray himself as the victim. He said his childhood was hard, said his father abandoned him, said he was never loved. A psychologist named Dr. Anil Agrawal was sent to the prison to assess Charles's mental state. Dr. Agrawal spoke with Charles for hours. He asked various questions, conducted psychological tests. Finally, he reported that Charles suffered from severe antisocial personality disorder. He said Charles lacked a conscience, lacked empathy, and was capable of lying without any feeling of guilt. Dr. Agrawal wrote in his report that Charles was a classic sociopath, someone who sees others as tools, not humans. He wrote that Charles's childhood, with its rejection and feeling of no identity, contributed to this disorder, but that this did not excuse him. He wrote that Charles was dangerous and would always be dangerous. Charles's trial began in Delhi in 1978. The courtroom was full of reporters, victims' families, and the curious. Charles entered the courtroom, dressed neatly and well-groomed, with a confident smile. It was as if he wasn't on trial for multiple murders. He waved to reporters, smiled at the cameras. He enjoyed the attention. The judge, an old and experienced man named Judge Kapoor, looked at Charles and said, "Mr. Sobhraj, you are accused of the premeditated murder of 7 people in Thailand, 3 in Nepal, and 2 in India. What do you say?" Charles said in a calm tone, "I am innocent." As the prosecutor, a young woman named Ms. Priya Sharma, stood up and said, "Your Honor, we have enough evidence to prove that Mr. Sobhraj is a serial killer. We have his confessions. We have witnesses. We have documents. He is a monster who must be punished." Charles laughed and said, "A monster? I am just a human. You don't know what a hard life I've had. You don't know what I've had to do to survive." The prosecutor said angrily, "You didn't have to kill anyone. You chose to. You enjoyed it." Charles fell silent. For a moment, his mask slicked. In his eyes, you could see coldness and darkness. But then, he smiled again and said, "I won't say anything without my lawyer." The trial lasted several months. Numerous witnesses testified. Teresa Knowlton and Jennifer Boulay came from America and told how Charles had poisoned them. Dominique Renelier came from France and told how Charles had deceived her. Hermann Knippenberg came from Germany and told how Charles had tried to poison him. Each of them told horrifying stories, stories that silenced the courtroom. The victims' families also testified. Lydia Skoner's father, an old man with tear-filled eyes, said, "My daughter just wanted to see the world. She just wanted to live. and this monster took her from me. The Tali Hakim's mother, a Turkish woman stammering with grief, said, "My son had his whole life ahead of him. He wanted to be a doctor. He wanted to help people. And now, he is gone." Charles listened to these testimonies, but showed no emotion. He just stared at the ceiling, as if none of this had anything to do with him. His lawyer tried to defend him, said the evidence wasn't enough, said the confessions were coerced. But the court didn't listen. Finally, Judge Kapoor delivered his verdict. He said, "Mr. Charles Sobhraj, you are one of the most dangerous criminals I have ever seen. You mercilessly killed innocent young people. You stole from them, deceived them, and then discarded them like trash. I sentence you to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole." When Charles heard this sentence, he smiled. He said, "Life? I will escape. I always escape." Judge Kapoor said angrily, "You will not escape again. You will remain in prison for the rest of your life." Charles Sobhraj was taken back to Tihar prison, this time with double the security. They put him in a solitary confinement cell, a place with no contact with other prisoners. Armed guards were always posted outside his cell. The cell walls were thick and windowless. The only light came from a dim bulb in the ceiling. For the first time in his life, Charles experienced the true feeling of being caged. But Charles was still Charles. He couldn't surrender. He started planning. He knew escaping from this cell was impossible, so he had to find another way. He started behaving well. He respected the guards, obeyed orders, never caused any problems. He wanted the authorities to think he had changed. A few months later, Charles requested permission to work in the prison library. The prison warden was hesitant at first, but Charles persisted. He said he wanted to change his life, wanted to contribute to society. Finally, the warden agreed. Charles started working in the library. He organized books, helped prisoners find books. He started building a network again. In the library, Charles met a young inmate named Ramesh. Ramesh was a 22-year-old boy imprisoned for theft. He was a simple-minded inmate who respected Charles. Charles got close to Ramesh and befriended him. He told Ramesh fake stories, helped him, gave him advice. Ramesh trusted Charles. One day, Charles said to Ramesh, "You know, I'm innocent. I never killed anyone. It was all a conspiracy." Ramesh said, surprised, "Really? But everyone says you're a serial killer." Charles said with fake sadness, "People always lie. I was just a merchant in the wrong place at the wrong time." Ramesh believed him. Charles started using Ramesh. He told Ramesh that when he was released, he should go to Charles's family and tell them he was in prison and needed help. Ramesh agreed. A few months later, Ramesh was released. He immediately went to the address Charles had given him. But when he got there, he found out the address was fake. Ramesh realized Charles had deceived him. He went to the police and told them Charles was planning something. The police went to the prison and spoke with the warden. They interrogated Charles. Charles said with a smile, "I just wanted to help a friend. I has no plans." But the prison warden no longer trusted him. He sent Charles back to solitary confinement and revoked all his privileges. Years passed. Charles grew old in prison. His hair turned white, his face wrinkled, but his eyes remained cold and calculating. He wrote letters to lawyers, to human rights organizations, claiming he was innocent, claiming he had confessed under torture. They wanted Charles extradited to stand trial in their countries. Charles knew if he went to Thailand, he would be executed. He contacted his lawyers and tried to prevent the extradition. But the Indian court decided to hand him over to Nepal, as his crimes there were more proven. In 2003, Charles Sobhraj was transferred to Nepal. He was placed in the central prison in Kathmandu. His new trial began that same year. This time, the evidence was stronger. The Nepali police had found the bodies of his victims. There were living witnesses who had seen Charles with the victims. The Nepali court sentenced Charles to life imprisonment. He was kept in the central prison in Kathmandu. But this prison wasn't like Tihar. It was old and dirty, with poor facilities. Charles lived in harsh conditions. He was no longer that young, energetic man, a sick and tired old man. In the Nepali prison, Charles started writing his memoirs. He wanted to write the story of his life, wanted to tell people who he was. He wrote a book titled I, Charles Sobhraj. In this book, he tried to portray himself as a victim, tried to justify why he did. Journalists from all over the world came to Nepal to interview him. They asked him why he killed, why he deceived, why he never showed remorse. Charles always answered with a smile, always lied, always tried to play the innocent. A French journalist named Julie Clark interviewed him in 2010. She asked Charles, "Did you never feel remorse? Never felt guilty?" Charles said in a cold tone, "Remorse is for the weak. I was never weak. I was always strong. I always survived." Julie said, surprised, "But you took innocent lives. You destroyed families." Charles laughed and said, "Everyone dies. I just sped up their time." Julie felt nauseous. She couldn't believe a human could be so cruel. In 2023, Charles Sobhraj was finally released from the Nepali prison. The Nepali court decided to release him due to his old age and poor health. He was handed over to France as he held French citizenship. When Charles arrived in France, he looked at the cameras with a smile and said, "I am finally free." But Charles's freedom didn't last long. He was under surveillance in France. The police kept an eye on him, making sure he wouldn't commit any more crimes. Charles lived in a small apartment in Paris, alone and forgotten. He was no longer that young, charming man. He was an old man with only dark memories. Charles died on September 24th, 2023, at the age of 79 in a hospital in Paris. The cause of death was heart failure. When the news of his death broke, some felt a sense of relief. Some said justice was finally served. But for the victims' families, there was no peace. For them, Charles was always the monster who took their loved ones away. Got him. We got witnesses. You can't deny it no more. Charles looked up at the ceiling and said, "Evidence? Evidence can be faked. Witnesses can lie. You can't prove nothing." Major Prasad leaned in close, his voice dead serious. "We found the victims' passports in your room. We found the drugs you used to poison him. We got testimony from people who saw you with the victims." Charles clammed up. For a second, his eyes went dark. Then he smirked. "All right, fine. Let's say I did it. Let's say I really offed him. Why would I tell you? What's in it for me?" Major Prasad shot back. "You cooperate with us? We can tell the judge you played ball. Might even get your sentence knocked down a bit." Charles let out a laugh, loud and empty. "You think I'm stupid? I know they don't do the death penalty in Nepal. I know the worst I'm getting is life. I know you can't ship me off to Thailand. Your laws won't allow it. So why would I cooperate?" Major Prasad was getting pissed. He slammed his fist on the table. "For the families. The victims' families got a right to know what happened to their people. They got a right to some peace." Charles just stared him down. "Families? Peace? Those are just words, man. The real deal is, the dead ain't coming back. Nothing I say is gonna bring him back to life." Major Prasad took a deep breath, trying to keep his cool. "At least tell me why. What made you do it?" Charles thought for a minute. Then he started talking, but this time his voice was different, more serious, darker. "When I was a kid, my old man left us, went back to India, left me with my mom in Vietnam. She married some French soldier, and we bounced to France. Over there, I was the outsider. Kids messed with me, called me a half-breed, said I didn't belong nowhere. I felt like I was worthless, like I was nobody." Major Prasad cut in. "So you started killing people because you had a rough childhood?" Charles shook his head. "Nah, it ain't that simple. I learned that to survive, you gotta be tough. I learned that other people are weak, that I could use them. The first time I stole something, I felt powerful. The first time I conned someone, I felt in control. And the first time I killed someone, I felt like God." Major Prasad looked shocked. "Like God?" Charles smiled. "Yeah, like God. Think about it. You decide who lives and who dies. You got the ultimate power. It's a feeling you can't even describe. It's addicting." Major Prasad said, disgusted and a little scared, "You're a monster." Charles laughed. "A monster? Maybe, but I'm honest. Unlike most people, I don't lie to myself. I know what I am. I know what I done, and I ain't sorry." Major Prasad stood up. "You're gonna be sorry. You're gonna rot in a cell for the rest of your life. You ain't never seeing the outside again." Charles said, calm as ever, "We'll see." For the next few days, the interrogations kept on. The Nepali cops tried to squeeze more out of Charles, but he was always on his guard. He only said what he wanted, only spilled what worked for him. He never told him the whole story. One day, a new guy, Colonel Bishnu Prasad, walked in. He was an older dude, been on the force for years, more experienced, sharper than the major. He sat down and just looked at Charles. Dead silence. Charles waited for him to start. Colonel, Bishnu said, quiet-like, "Mr. Sobhraj, I know you're a smart man. I know you've been running circles around the law for years. But now, the game's up. You're here, and you ain't going nowhere. But I gotta ask you something. Not as a cop, but as a man. Did you ever think, if you had a different life, maybe you would have chosen a different path?" For the first time, Charles actually seemed to think about it. He went quiet, stared at the floor. Then he said, "Maybe. If my old man didn't bail, if I grew up somewhere I belonged, if someone loved me, maybe. But that's a whole lot of maybes. The truth is, I didn't get that life. I got this one, and I chose how to live it." Colonel Bishnu nodded. "I'm sorry you made that choice." Charles gave a bitter smile. "Yeah, me too. Not for what I did, but for getting caught." The interrogations dragged on for weeks. The Nepali cops managed to get some new info, but Charles never spilled everything. He always had secrets, always held something back. Even in a cell, he was still playing his games. In one of the last sessions, Major Prasad asked him, "How many people did you kill?" The real number. Charles smiled. "I don't know the exact count. Maybe 10, maybe 20, maybe more. I stopped keeping track. To me, they're just faces I remember. Just names I forgot." Major Prasad looked. When the interrogations finally wrapped up, the Nepali police put together a full report. They concluded Charles Sobhraj killed at least 12 people all over Asia. But the real number was probably higher. They said he was a psychopathic serial killer with no guilt or remorse. They said he'd be dangerous for the rest of his life. In prison, Charles kept trying to play the victim. He told reporters he was innocent, told lawyers he confessed under torture. He never gave up, never admitted the whole truth. An American reporter, Tom Thompson, interviewed him in 2007. He asked Charles, "If you could turn back time, what would you do different?" Charles smiled and said, "I'd be more careful. I wouldn't make the same mistakes. I wouldn't get caught." Tom, surprised, said, "You don't mean you wouldn't kill again?" Charles laughed. "Nah, man, I'd just do it better." That answer shocked the world. People couldn't believe someone could be that ruthless. Psychologists tried to explain that Charles had a severe antisocial personality disorder, that he had no conscience, that he couldn't feel empathy. But no explanation could ease the horror for the victims' families. The mother of Henk Bintanja, the Dutch guy Charles killed, said in an interview, "I can never forgive. I can never forget. That monster took my son from me. He destroyed my son's future. He destroyed my life, and he ain't even sorry. How can he call himself a man? The father of Teresa Knowlton, the American girl who was Charles's first known victim, said, "For the rest of my life, I'll have my daughter's picture in my head. How happy she was when she left on her trip. How full of hope she was. And that devil, he killed her like she was an animal. I hope he burns in hell." That's how all the families felt. They wanted justice. They wanted revenge. They wanted Charles to suffer like he made their loved ones suffer. But Nepali law wouldn't allow it. Charles just got life in prison. On March 4th, 2004, the Supreme Court of Nepal convened to deliver the final verdict against Charles Sobhraj. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, lawyers, victims' families, curious onlookers. Everyone wanted to see the final chapter of the Serpent story. Charles walked in, handcuffed, but with his head held high, a smirk on his face. He was acting like he was in a play, not a courtroom. The judge, Mrs. Sunita Sharma, a middle-aged woman with a stern face, sat at the bench and looked at Charles. She said, "Mr. Charles Sobhraj, you are accused of the premeditated murders of Connie Jo Bronkhorst and Laurent Carrière in 1975 in Kathmandu, Nepal. This court, after reviewing all evidence and testimony, finds you guilty. Your sentence is life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." Charles smirked and said, "Your Honor, I object. I'm innocent. This trial has been a sham." Judge Sharma said angrily, "You had years to mount a defense. You presented no compelling evidence. This court has found you guilty based on solid proof. The sentence is passed. This trial is over." Charles was led out of the courtroom. Reporters swarmed him, shouting questions. "Charles, how do you feel? Any regrets? Do you have anything to say to the families?" Charles stopped and looked at the cameras. He said calmly, "I tell the families I'm sorry, not for what I did, but because they believed I was guilty." That line sent a wave of rage through the crowd. Connie Jo Bronkhorst's mother, an elderly woman who had come from the Netherlands, screamed, "You're a monster. You're a killer. You should die." Police calmed her and led her away. Charles just smiled and left. They took Charles back to Kathmandu Central Prison. This prison was an old, run-down building in the heart of the city. Gray, cracked walls, small windows with rusty bars, and a dark, damp atmosphere were everywhere. They put Charles in the high-security wing, in a cell just for him. Charles's cell was a small room with a bed, a toilet, and a sink. The walls were bare. The light was dim. Silence ruled. But Charles got used to it. He read books. He wrote. He thought. He was still looking for a way out. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. Months into years. Charles grew old in prison. His hair turned white. His face wrinkled. His body weakened. But his mind was still sharp. He told the prison authorities, that he needed to be transferred to an outside hospital, or he would die. The prison authorities hesitated, but the doctors insisted. They transferred Charles to Kathmandu Central Hospital under heavy guard. In the hospital, Charles started planning his escape again. He was kind to the nurses, smiled at them, talked with them. He tried to win one over to help him. A young nurse named Sangeeta became interested in Charles. She thought he was a poor old man wrongly imprisoned. Charles told her, "You know, I'm innocent. I never killed anyone. It was all a setup." Sangeeta believed him. She said, "I'm sorry this happened to you." Charles smiled and said, "If you could help me, I'd be forever in your debt." Sangeeta said, "How can I help?" Charles said, "Just a phone. I need to call my lawyer. If you lend me your phone, I'll just make one call." Sangeeta hesitated, but Charles kept pushing. He said, "You're the only one who can help me. You're the only one who trusts me." Sangeeta finally agreed. She gave him her phone. Charles made a call, but not to his lawyer. He called a French journalist he knew. The journalist Pierre Boulanger was a young man who had been trying to get an interview with Charles for years. Charles told him, "I'm in the hospital. If you come for an exclusive interview, I'll tell you everything." Pierre immediately flew to Kathmandu. When Pierre arrived at the hospital, Charles saw him and smiled. He said, "I'm glad you came. Now I want to tell my real story." Pierre set up his camera and recorder. Charles started talking, but not about his crimes. He talked about how he was innocent, how the interview lasted for hours. Pierre asked tough questions, but Charles always had slippery answers. He never told the truth. By the end of the interview, Pierre felt used. His health worsened. He developed various illnesses: diabetes, high blood pressure, kidney failure. He was no longer that strong young man. He was a broken, sick Charles's lawyer, a Frenchman named Isabelle Cotant-Pere, submitted a request for his release. She argued that Charles was a severely ill 76-year-old man, that he was no longer a danger to society, that he should be freed, that he should remain in prison for life. But the Supreme Court of Nepal, after review, decided to release Charles. They said he had spent many years in prison. He was old and sick, and keeping him incarcerated under these conditions was inhumane. On December 21st, 2023, Charles Sobhraj was released from prison in Nepal. All right, listen up. It was a cold day in Kathmandu. Charles Sobhraj. The sky was all cloudy, and this wicked wind was howling. Reporters from all over the world were camped out in front of the prison, waiting for the moment the snake would slither out of his cage. Cameras were ready, mics in hand. Everybody was itching to get that first shot, that first word. At 10 in the morning, the prison gates swung open. Out walks Charles Sobhraj. This 79-year-old dude with white hair and a face full of wrinkles. He had a wooden cane. His steps, then that smile, man. It was the same old cold, conniving smile. He said, real calm, "I am happy to be free. I spent so many years in prison for nothing. I was always innocent, and I still am." Some reporter yelled, "But you confessed to the murders." Charles shook his head and said, "I never confessed. Those confessions were forced. They were under pressure. I was a victim of a corrupt system. Now, I just want to go home, to France, and live the rest of my life in peace." Couton Père took Charles's hand and steered him towards a waiting car. They got in and headed for the airport. On the way, Charles stared out the window at the streets of Kathmandu. He hadn't seen this city in years, but now everything had changed. New buildings, more cars, people on their cell phones. The world had moved on, and he'd been left behind. At the airport, security was tight. The Nepali police wanted to make damn sure Charles was really leaving the country. They escorted him all the way to the gate. Charles boarded the plane, a direct flight to Paris. He sat by the window and looked out at the sky. The plane took off, and Kathmandu, Nepal, Asia, it all just faded away behind him. During the flight, Charles thought about the past. He thought about all the years he'd spent inside, all his victims, all his lies. But he didn't feel any remorse, not one bit. He was only thinking about the future. He wanted to be free. He wanted to live. He wanted to be forgotten. When the plane touched down at Charles de Gaulle Airport, the reporters were waiting again. But this time, the French police were there too. They took Charles to a private room and grilled him. They wanted to be sure he wasn't planning on pulling any new stunts. A police officer told Charles, "Mr. Sobhraj, you are free in France, but we will be watching you. You take one wrong step, just one, and we will arrest you." Charles just smiled and said, "Don't worry. I just want to live a quiet life." They took Charles to a small apartment on the outskirts of Paris, a place the French government had set up for him. The apartment had one bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a bathroom. The window looked out on the street, where regular people were living their lives, working, laughing. Charles watched them and felt like a complete alien. He wasn't a part of that world anymore. For the first few days, Charles was alone. He'd go to the store, buy food, come back home, and watch TV. He'd watch the news, watch documentaries, and every time his name was mentioned, he'd smile. He was still famous. People still knew who he was. But Charles's fame was the dark kind. When people saw him on the street, they'd cross to the other side. Nobody talked to him. Nobody smiled at him. He was like a plague, something everybody avoided. Charles got used to the loneliness. He'd always been alone, from when he was a kid right up to now. One day, a young woman named Clara showed up at Charles's apartment door. She was a French journalist who wanted to interview him. She said, "Mr. Sobhraj, I want to tell your story, the real one, not what the media says." Charles invited her in. Clara stepped inside and looked around. The place was simple and empty. No decorations, no memories. She sat down and turned on her camera. Charles sat opposite her and smiled. Clara asked, "How do you feel now that you're free?" Charles said, "I feel at peace. I can finally breathe. I can think. I can live in our own ways. I'm just more honest than the rest. I own what I am." Clara felt sick. She couldn't connect with this man. She ended the interview and left the apartment. After she was gone, Charles was alone again. He looked in the mirror and saw an old man staring back. Was that him? Was that the same Charles Sobhraj they used to call the Serpent? Weeks went by. Charles was still alone in that apartment. He read books, watched TV, thought about the past. One night, he had a horrible nightmare, but there was no one there. He was alone, but for the first time in his life, he felt real fear. Fear of death. Charles went home and lay down on his bed. He stared at the ceiling and thought about his life. 79 years, full of lies, crime, running, and loneliness. What did he have left? He had no friends, no family, no love. All he had were the dark memories, memories that hunted him in the night. On September 22nd, 2023, Charles Sobhraj died in his sleep. His heart stopped, and he just didn't wake up. He was alone in that small apartment with no one to hold his hand, no one to say his name. His death was quiet, like a shadow disappearing. When the French police found his body, there was no sign of any arrangements, any last wishes. He hadn't left a will. He had no message. They took his body to a cemetery on the outskirts of Paris and buried him in an unmarked grave. No service was held. Nobody came. No flowers were left. The news of Charles Sobhraj's death spread around the world. Some said justice was finally served. Some said he should have died sooner. But for the victims' families, the news brought no peace. They still had their pain. They still had their grief. They still had the memory of the loved ones they'd lost. Lydie Schooner's mother, now a 90-year-old woman, when she heard Charles had died, said, "He's gone, but my daughter is never coming back. He can burn in hell. I have no forgiveness for him." Connie Jo Bronkhorst's father said, "His death was too easy. He should have suffered, like my son suffered. But at least now, he can't hurt anyone else." And that was the end of the story of Charles Sobhraj, the man they called the Serpent, the man who killed with a smile, the man who never felt sorry. He died, alone and forgotten, like a shadow fading into the dark.